marked by immorality, idolatry, and war. And yet, in the midst of all of that bad, there's something good. There's a heartwarming story of devotion and faithfulness. Oddly enough, it's not an Israelite who shows the faithfulness and the devotion. It's a Moabite widow named Ruth who leaves her homeland to be with her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi, in the land of Israel. And God honors that commitment, the commitment that Ruth makes by guiding her to the field of Boaz, a relative of Naomi, where she gathers grain, and she not only finds food, but she also finds a place in the genealogy of Christ as well. It's been said that the book of Ruth serves two purposes. Number one, it explains how Ruth, a Moabitess, came to be an ancestor of David and ultimately the Messiah, but also to illustrate how God rewards those who make wise spiritual choices and show faithful family loyalty. Now, while the book of Ruth is fairly brief, it's only 4 chapters, makes it very easy to read it in one sitting, we're going to use the book of Ruth as our October series. We're going to talk about it each Sunday in October, the 4 Sundays, and one Sunday for each chapter. So let's start with Ruth chapter 1. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of their children, their 2 sons, were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out to the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they will become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. For it is exceedingly bitter to me that for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Don't urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more. Also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. In chapter 1 of Ruth, we learn of Ruth's noble choice. But there's a backstory. Okay, her noble choice is preceded by some other choices that, maybe weren't quite as wise as they might have appeared to be. And it starts with a fateful trip to Moab. Anytime you see that word fateful, you immediately know something bad is going to happen. And yes, something bad happens. In fact, something bad happens, which leads to something worse happening, which leads to something even worse, or the worst happening. So we begin, though, with the setting for the story of Ruth. Ruth 1:1, in the days of the judges, prior to the kings of Israel, which makes sense because Ruth was an ancestor of David, who was the second king of Israel. So, this has to take place before that. It's in the period of the judges. There's a famine in the land of Judah. Now, the land of Judah is over in this area here, right in here. The city of Bethlehem is located right there. Family of 4 leave Bethlehem to dwell in Moab. Bethlehem's about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, the birthplace, and is the birthplace of David and the birthplace of somebody, Jesus. Yeah, that was who it was. The country of Moab is over here. Just the other side of the Dead Sea. They were descendants of Lot. Now remember, Lot was the nephew of Abraham. And so you might say that the country of Moab and the country of Israel were cousin countries, we might say. Well, we might say that, but sometimes they were enemies of Israel. For example, in Judges 3:12 through 30, Ehud delivers Israel from the hand of Moab. But sometimes they were the friends of Israel. In 1 Samuel 22:3 and 4, David leaves his mom and dad with the Moabites while he himself is running for his life from King Saul. So that gives you a little bit of background to the setting of what's going on and everything. The family in verse 2, Elimelech the father, Naomi the mother, Mahalan and Chilion the sons, they were Ephrathites. Excuse me. Bethlehem was also known as Ephrath. Genesis 35:19, Micah 5 verse 2, both mention Bethlehem and Ephrath as the same place. So they make a move, again in verse 2, prompted by the famine. Now, from our worldly perspective, this was a smart move. Because there was a famine in Israel, so they left Israel to go where there was not a famine. Makes sense, doesn't it? Except some would say this actually shows a lack of faith in God, who had always made provisions for his people when they needed them. For example, when they were leaving Egypt, fleeing from slavery. You remember they cried out, they didn't have any food, so what did God do? He provided manna for them. When they didn't have water, he provided water for them. When they got tired of the manna, then he provided quail for them. So, God has always taken care of his people. Always. Whenever they had a need, he took care of their need. However, this is, remember, during the period of the judges. A lot of times, God would use famine to punish the people of Israel for their unfaithfulness. And perhaps that's what's going on here, is that this famine, it may have been there was no rain, or it could have been kind of like in the days of Gideon, when the Midianites had just trampled all the fields and wouldn't let anything grow in Israel. But whatever the case is, whatever the cause of the famine is, they leave Israel and go to Moab. And while they're in Moab, death strikes 3 times. First thing that happens in verse 3 is that Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow with 2 sons, living in a foreign land. Not a very advantageous position for Naomi, to say the least. Rabbinic tradition suggests that his death was punishment for either greed or was punishment for him leaving his homeland. During that time of that famine, this could have been the result of that. Then Mahalon and Chilion marry women of Moab, verse 4 tells us. Mahalon married Ruth. Chilion married Orpah. Now, you're saying, wait a second. It doesn't say who married who in here. It just says that they married Moabite women and it gives it 2 names. You're right, it doesn't. But I read ahead in the book of Ruth. In Ruth 4, verse 10, it tells us that Ruth was the widow of Mahalon. So therefore, Ruth married Mahalon and Orpah married Chilion. So anyway, such marriages with women of Moab were strongly suspect, if not flat out wrong. 1 Kings 11, 1 and 2, Nehemiah 13, 23 through 27. In fact, throughout the Old Testament, God warns the Israelites about intermarrying with other people. So they live in Moab for about 10 years. Not sure if that's 10 years from when they left Israel or 10 years after they got married. It doesn't really matter. But then Mahalon and Chilion die, verse 5 tells us. Again, rabbinic tradition suggests that it was because of leaving Judah. And also it could have been punishment for their marriages as well. Leaving Naomi, a widow, and childless in a foreign country, which she took as divine judgment against her, verse 13 tells us. So Elimelech and his family and his sons went to Moab to find bread, and they found graves instead. Grieving the loss of her husband and her 2 sons, Naomi gives thought to returning to her homeland. And so she makes what we might call a fateful trip to Moab, but then a faithful return to Judah. Naomi chooses to go home, to return home. She hears in the fields that the famine had ended in the area of Bethlehem. The Lord's blessings had returned to Judah. The Lord had given them food. And so she gets her 2 daughters-in-law, and they're going to go back to the land of Judah. However, Naomi encourages her daughters-in-law to remain in Moab. She knows that, they're from Moab. She knows that's probably where they'll be most comfortable. She knows that's probably where they'll find a better life than she could provide for them in Judah. So she encourages them to return to their mother's house as they were on their way to leave. But Naomi says there's no ill will. She wishes them the best. She prays God's blessings on them, that God would treat them kindly as they had treated their husbands, her sons, kind, and as they had treated her kindly. She prays that they will find rest in the home of another husband, prompting a sorrowful display of great affection. But even as they are encouraged by Naomi to return to their mother's home, Ruth chooses to stay with her. At first, both daughters-in-law want to go with Naomi. They're both, no, we're going to go with you, and they're willing to return with her to her people, which speaks very highly of their love for Naomi and their duty as daughters-in-law. I mean, you think about it. Those that are married, how many daughters-in-law would go with their mother-in-law voluntarily somewhere? Yeah, that doesn't normally happen very often, does it? But anyway, it tells us a lot, though, about Ruth and Orpah, though. I mean, at least they were good girls for Moabites anyway, right? So they are both are going to go, but Naomi again tries to discourage them, says, am I going to have another husband and have more sons that you can marry? And even if I had a husband today and had sons would you wait for them to marry? It just doesn't make any sense for you to go with us. It grieves her to see them suffer because of God's punishment of her. And so weeping Orpah kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and returns to her homeland. But Ruth cannot be discouraged. She won't be discouraged. Ruth clings to her mother-in-law, and Naomi tries once again to persuade her to return, but Ruth then utters one of the most meaningful, one of the most emotional statements in the entire Bible, I believe. She vows in verses 16 and 17, her noble choice is to go wherever Naomi goes, to live wherever Naomi lives, to make the people of Naomi her people, to make the God of Naomi her God, to die and be buried where Naomi is buried, and to let nothing but death ever come between the two of them. And in making such a choice, Ruth has basically become a proselyte to Judaism. Naomi realizes that Ruth is determined to go with her, and so she says no more to her. Then Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem. And their arrival sparks a lot of excitement in the city. Wow, is this Naomi? Has she come back and everything? And Naomi believes, though, that she should be called Mara. She wants to have a name change, we might say. Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. And she says, I left pleasant, but I've returned bitter. Because of the way that she left Judah full, she's returned empty. She feels that the Lord has dealt bitterly with her, and she believes the Lord has testified against her and has punished her. And so she says, don't call me pleasant anymore, call me bitter. And this may be true. If you look over at Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 19. The Israelites are warned. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall you be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, the increase of your herds and the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. There's a lot of curses if the Israelites don't obey the voice of the Lord. The Israelites, again, this is in the period of the Judges, they don't obey the voice of the Lord. And they suffer the consequences of that. Yet not all suffering is caused by divine punishment. You think about our study on Wednesday nights of Job. His suffering wasn't caused by divine punishment. Might say his suffering was caused by divine bragging, because God was bragging about him to Satan, and Satan says, oh yeah, well, let me do some stuff to him, and God gives him permission and everything. She may have been the innocent victim of someone else's sins. Maybe her husband, Elimelech, didn't necessarily die from natural causes or even supernatural causes. Perhaps he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and was killed. Maybe the same thing with Mahalan and Chilion. They just weren't in the right place at the right time. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they ended up getting killed. We don't know for sure how it happened, but we know that it did happen, and we know how Naomi took it. She took it as divine punishment against her. And so Naomi and Ruth settle in Bethlehem. Naomi, a woman who left the land with fullness and has returned with nothing, with emptiness. A woman who left the land with husband and sons and has returned a widow and childless. And Ruth, the Moabitess, The Moabitess who is a part of that nation that God had warned them about. Now living in a strange land, in the land of Judah. Their arrival was at the beginning of the barley harvest, which actually sets the stage for the events that are going to happen in the next chapter, which sets up an entirely new beginning in the lives of Naomi and Ruth. This story certainly illustrates the importance of making choices. Choices come with consequences. Sometimes those consequences are good, but sometimes those consequences are bad. Elimelech and his sons made a choice. They made a choice to leave the Judah and go to Moab, which may have appeared to have been a smart choice from a purely human decision or perspective. It may have appeared to be a good business decision. Maybe. But ultimately, it left Naomi a widow and childless in a strange land. Ruth, on the other hand, made her noble choice that didn't appear to be a smart choice from a worldly view. To leave her family behind. To leave everything that she knew that was familiar to her behind. And to go with this lady who she had known for maybe 10 years to her country. And to adopt her customs and her way of life. To leave her family and her false religion for the one true God and his family. But whereas Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion's choices led to tragedy, Ruth's choice led to triumph. It would have both temporal and eternal blessings. In Mark chapter 10, verses 29 and 30, Jesus tells us, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses, brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." Sometimes the choice is not necessarily between right and wrong. It's between good and better. So don't be too hard on Orpah. She wanted to come. She wanted to return to Judah with Naomi. She just wanted to return to her mother's house more. Yet any choice made will be the right choice if it's made with these words of Jesus in mind that he speaks in Matthew 6:33. "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and these things will be added to you as well." See, Naomi left everything and Ruth left everything and followed Naomi and became a proselyte to Judaism. She began to worship the true and living God. Ruth's noble choice to follow Naomi and her God illustrates the truth of Jesus' words. She was blessed. She was blessed, incredibly blessed, because of her decision to follow Naomi and to follow Naomi's example and to follow Naomi in serving God. See, anytime that we are faced with a difficult decision, it always needs to be made with those words of Jesus in mind. What's going to be best, not necessarily for you, what's going to be best for the kingdom of God? What's going to be best for you as a Christian? What choice do you need to make to ensure that you are truly putting the kingdom of God first in your life? If you're guided by what is best for the kingdom, things are going to work out okay. It may not be like you wanted to. There may be some hardships along the way. But in the end, you're going to find out that that was the most noble choice that you to follow Jesus, to begin to walk with Jesus, to begin to make Jesus Lord of their life by being immersed in the watery grave of baptism, having their past sins washed away. If so, there's no more noble choice that you can make this morning than to make that choice, to make that decision. Or maybe you made that decision, but since that time you made some other choices. Some other choices that weren't quite as noble. And maybe you need to repent. Maybe that repentance is something private, just between you and God. Then you need to do it. Maybe that repentance involves something public. The public response asking, is a simple church body to pray with you and pray for you. Whatever that choice is that you have to make it the right choice. Make it the noble choice. Make it the choice for the kingdom of God. We can help you in some way do that. We'll help respond.